If you have your Bibles, we're turning to Ruth chapter 3. We have been in a series now for 3 weeks. This is the third week in Ruth chapter 3. So you have your Bible on your phone. You might want to go ahead and turn there. If you brought a Bible with you, if you could turn there. There are also some Bibles on some of the chairs around you, so feel free to grab one of those as well. And we're going to be jumping into Ruth chapter 3. So I recognize that not everybody here has been here the last 2 weeks. And so it seems right for us just to back up a little bit. In fact, has anybody been here, like you've been here the first 2 weeks, the third week in a row? Anybody? Okay, so you guys get an A+, but most of us have not. So let's bring people up to speed and think about where we are in this story. Chapter 1. All right, here's how I would probably define chapter 1. It's a hopeless condition with a relentless commitment. Hopeless condition, relentless commitment. Let's think about it this way. The story of Ruth takes place during a time where it's very dark for Israel. Things are not going well in the life of Israel. And what we see is that this book is written, or this occasion takes place during the dark history of the Judges in the Old Testament, which means the last verse in the book of Judges says this: in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So it's a bit of a free-for-all for Israel. They're just doing whatever they want to do, and they are drifting away from God. And then when you turn the next page in the Bible, you get to the book of Ruth. And Ruth is a story that shows us how God uses a foreigner, an outsider, from a hostile nation, Moab, to become the eventual grandmother of King David. No king in Israel, they do what they want, and here comes Ruth, and she will become the great-grandmother of a great king, King David. But more than that, she will come into the lineage of the greatest king of all kings, King Jesus. I mean, it's an amazing story. So, no king, people are doing whatever they want. A king comes through Ruth, King David, and through that lineage, Jesus comes to be born. The story begins here with Ruth with a famine. If you remember, for those of you who were here, if not, it starts with a famine in Bethlehem. The name means house of bread, Bethlehem, house of bread. It's a famine. There is no bread. Interestingly, as we said, Jesus Christ will one day be born in this town. He is Himself bread, the bread of life. So here we go. This Israelite family of 4, famine, they decide to move to Moab, from Bethlehem to Moab. That is about 60 miles. I think there's a map here that will show that here they are in the land of Judah, Bethlehem. They make their way east about 60 miles, which is about 100 kilometers, in order to get to Moab, seeking for a better life. They become immigrants here, looking for food, looking for a better life. But instead of finding something better, what they find is tragedy. You can see here also on the top screen on the right is the land of Moab, where they are headed. On the lower screen they leave Bethlehem, and they're hoping for something better, but they don't find that. They find tragedy. And so what happens once they get to Moab, eventually Elimelech, the father, dies, leaving Naomi a widow, the wife, mother, a widow. And not only that, but the 2 sons that went with them, they pass away, they die as well, leaving Naomi childless. The 2 sons had married before they died. They have 2 daughters, so she has 2 daughters-in-law, and that is her life now in Moab. Circumstances change. The famine is over in Bethlehem, and so she decides to go back to Bethlehem from Moab, and she makes her journey. And in the process of this, the 2 daughters-in-law decide to go back with Naomi. Naomi encourages them, no, you got to stay in Moab. This is where your family is. This is where you can raise your own children. Stay here. And so one of those daughters-in-law, one of them decides to stay in Moab. The other one says, I'm going with you. And that is, of course, Ruth. And she makes this relentless commitment to stick with Naomi. And you've heard the words here probably, maybe at a wedding sometime. But these famous words we hear from Ruth, where you go to Naomi, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And so there we go. That's chapter 1. Then we jump into chapter 2. So they make their way back to Moab, Naomi and Ruth. And as they get back, it's harvest season, and God's sovereign care is so obvious in chapter 2. We looked at this last week. Ruth ends up working in a field. They're poor. She's got to go to work. She finds a field. She goes to this field that's owned by a good and very noble man. His name is Boaz, who happens to be a relative of Naomi's husband. And that's going to be key here in this story. So we see God's providence. God is taking care of Naomi and Ruth as they make their way to this field. Then Boaz takes care of Ruth as she's working in this field. Remember, she's a Moabite. They're enemies of Israel. And she's also single. And so Boaz makes sure that she's safe from the harm of others while others are working in the field. And so we see God's providence and we see God's protection over Ruth and Naomi. But then Boaz also helps Ruth by letting her work alongside the other women, giving her an even greater harvest. So not only does she get to glean from the harvest on the outside edges, which was provided by the law, but Boaz makes sure she really gets right in the middle of things. And so we see God's provision as well. God's providence, protection, and provision through this person, Boaz. And then God works through this man, Boaz, saying to Ruth, and this will be a key verse here coming up this morning. All that you have done, saying to Ruth, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you didn't know before. The Lord will repay you for what you have done, and a full reward will be given by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So Boaz makes this recognition. Ruth, this is what you've done. I recognize it. You left home. You came with Naomi. You've sought protection under God's wings. I see that all that you have done. So what do we see up to this point, these first 2 chapters? We see that this is incredibly relevant for our day. Because what we're watching here is the inevitable pain of living in a broken world and the providence of God to take care of His people. We've all discovered this, right? The inevitable pain of living in a broken world, and yet the providence of God to care for His people. This song has been meaningful to me as of late. Andrew Peterson, who actually I know has been here before, he wrote this song and he sings these beautiful words. And each of the first lines, when the line is over, there's a response to it. And so as it's sung, there's a response that comes back. And I want you to give me the response, all right? So I'll read a line, and then you say, we do, okay? Let's do this. Here are these words. Do you feel the world is broken? Do you feel the shadows deepen? But do you know that all the dark won't stop the light from coming through? Do you wish that you could see it all made new? We do. And that's the story of Ruth. There's darkness. It's a hard time, but the light is shining through. There's brokenness, but God is making all things new. And this is the way that God works in our life. That's the story of Ruth. In fact, last week, I think we looked at this verse, Ephesians 1:10. Because we are united with Christ, He makes everything work out according to His plan. Even through difficult times, through hardship, through struggle, through darkness, brokenness, God is at work through it all. That's what we're seeing here in the book of Ruth. So let's pick up in chapter 3, and let's see what the Lord has to say to us through this chapter. Verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, which is Ruth, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" So Naomi now is in a completely different place emotionally. If you remember, they come back from Moab. They're making their way back to Bethlehem. People see her. She says, "Don't call me Naomi." That means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. And she's been inwardly focused. It's been a very difficult time, but now she is looking outwardly. She's looking out for Ruth. And so she's saying, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you?" She wants the very best for Ruth. She wants to help Ruth find a home. Ruth left her home in Moab. She left her future of a husband and family. And now she's saying, "I need to help you find a home." Verse 2. "Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say, I will do." Here's what's happening. Naomi is coaching Ruth, and she is saying, "Clean up. Get your most expensive perfume. Put on your very best. And then at the right time, after Boaz has eaten his dinner, go to where he is, uncover his feet, lie down, and then wait." And then Ruth says, "I'll do it. That's exactly what I'll do." Now, that sounds a little bit confusing to us. It's a completely different culture. We don't understand some of these things. So let me just make some explanation here that might help us follow along. So in the previous chapter, we saw that Boaz is a close family member of the clan of Elimelech. This is Naomi's husband. So Boaz is a relative. All right, he's close to the family. And he is one who can be a kinsman redeemer or a guardian redeemer. And basically, what that means is that Ruth potentially could come underneath the leadership of Boaz in marriage. This would not be Naomi at this particular point in her life because she was probably older. She could not have children with Boaz, but Ruth could. So the guardian redeemer was a relative who took responsibility for the extended family. This was God's way of providing for a family in need whose husband had passed away. When a woman's husband died, the law allowed her to marry a brother of her dead husband. But Naomi had no more sons for Ruth to marry, which then meant that the nearest relative to the deceased husband could be then the guardian redeemer and marry the widow. And it wasn't required, but he could do so. If that nearest relative passed on the opportunity, then the next relative could step in. And if no relative would step in to marry the widow, then the likely outcome would be complete poverty for the widow. So that's what's happening here with this guardian redeemer. Now, Boaz, during harvest season, he's at the threshing floor. I think we've got a picture of a threshing floor, and this is where Boaz would be. He's at this threshing floor, separating chaff from the grain during harvest season. And he would eat, probably work during the day, he would eat in the evening, and then he would go to bed at night, and he would get some sleep. And Ruth is to come in, uncover his feet, which would not only wake up Boaz, but it would send a signal. It's a gesture symbolizing her desire to marry Boaz. Uncover his feet, it was said. So this is not something provocative. It's not something immoral. It's a bold move of faith. What Ruth is doing here is basically saying, would you marry me? Would you cover me in marriage? Okay, so here we go. Let's continue on. So she, Ruth, went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, his heart was merry, and he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. She came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down, and at midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And there it is. That's the ask. Spread your wings over your servant. We saw this phrase. We read this phrase a little bit earlier. Remember that in verse 2, Boaz mentioned that Ruth had already taken shelter under God's wings. And now Ruth is saying to Boaz, "Would you shelter me with your wings?" The NIV translation here says, "Spread the corner of your garment over me." In other words, be my protection, be my covering, be my husband. It's the same language of Ezekiel chapter 16 where God says that He spread the corner of His garment over Israel. He covered their body, so to speak. He clothed them with costly garments. He adorned them with jewelry, and He led them, entered into a covenant with them. This is what Ruth now is asking of Boaz. Cover me in marriage. Okay, verse 10. And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he will not redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." So Boaz basically says, "Ruth, you could have gone after a younger man, but for the sake of Naomi, I see that you've come to me to be the guardian redeemer. And while I'm in a position to redeem you, to marry you, to care for you, there's another relative closer to you, and if he won't do it, then I will." And then the chapter closes like this. So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, "No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl that you are wearing and hold it out." And when she did so, he poured in 6 measures of barley and placed it in a bundle for her. And then he went back to town, and when Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her, and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter-in-law, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." And so Ruth discreetly makes her way back to Naomi with this large gift from Boaz, and Naomi tells Ruth to wait, that Boaz will follow through and settle the matter that day. Chapter 3. So that's the story. So what are we going to do with that? What do we take from this for our own life? And what I want to suggest as we close today is our 3 applications from this story for us. And they all have to do with faith, living by faith. Because I think that's exactly what is happening in this story. Naomi and Ruth are living by faith. And here's the first application. Faith rests in the providence of God. Faith rests in the providence of God. We see God's providence all over the place. In fact, that's the title of the series, God's Providential Care. And we can see it in this story. And I want to read just a clip from the commentary that I read as I was studying for this message. Listen to this. The theological atmosphere in the book of Ruth is unique. Absent are the dramatic miracles and wonders of other biblical books. You don't see those in Ruth. In fact, God never speaks at all. We don't hear the voice of God. But in between all of these things that happen, accidents, quote, accidents happen. hints of divine providence is quietly at work. And he goes on to say, Ruth just happens to glean in Boaz's field on the very day that Boaz just happens to visit. And then Boaz just happens to reach the city gate just as the relative he needs to see passes by. There are all of these, quote, coincidences. It just happens. God is providentially at work. You don't see the miracles, you don't see the amazing wonders of God that we see in other places, but God is quietly at work in Ruth's life. This is so important because when we find ourselves in the valleys, there are ups and then there are downs and there are times where it's confusing and God, where are you? God is working. He's working behind the scenes, as we can see in this story. Easy to look back and see that, but it's so difficult when you're in the middle of it. And that's why we need to rest in God's providential care. Maybe you've heard this story of the white stallion. I've heard it before, and maybe you have too, but it's so relevant to what's happening here. Story of a white stallion that rides into a poor man's stable. The villagers tell this old man who is struck with poverty, it's God's blessing on you. Sell that horse for money. But the man loves the horse for companionship. He doesn't want to sell it, and he doesn't. And then the horse runs away. The villagers come back and they tell the old man, you fool, you should have sold it. It's God's curse on you. But then one day the horse returned to the old man. And as it returned, he brought a dozen more horses, white stallions, with him. Well, the villagers come back to the old man and they say, you were right. It's God's blessing on your life. But while the man's only son was training now these dozen horses, he broke his leg. The son did. The old man now had no help. The villagers came to the old man and said, we told you should have sold the horses in the first place. It's God's curse on you. And then a war breaks out. And the villagers have to send their sons away to war, many who will never return. But the old man's son with the broken leg couldn't go to war. He had to stay home. And the villagers said, you were right. It's God's blessing on you after all. And that's the end of the story. It's like, really? That's the end of the story? And that's the whole point. We want to know what happens next, but the point is that it doesn't matter because God is at work through the whole thing. I got no work, God provides work. I've got this struggle, God works through that struggle. And that is the way life is. And so we put our trust in we rest in the providence of God. Does that make sense? We rest in the providence of God. Here's the second application I think we can make here. Faith is not fatalism. It often requires movement. We don't just say, well, God is God. He's providential. He's sovereign over all things. He's working behind the scenes, so I'll just rest. There's nothing for me to do. That's not what happens in this story. Faith is not fatalism. Sometimes it requires that we take a step. And that's exactly what we see here, the plan that Naomi came up with. Let's do something about our situation. And then Ruth follows through and she takes a huge, bold step. I mean, this was a male-dominated culture. Ruth was a Moabite. This was the enemy of Israel. And she is the one who takes the lead at Naomi's suggestion, and she puts herself out there. Best dress, best perfume. She puts herself out there, and she takes a step, and she makes the proposal. There's a possibility of rejection. What if Boaz says no? This could go completely the other direction, but she takes a step. And sometimes God is saying, take a step. Faith is not fatalism. Don't just wait for some miracle to occur. God is working, no doubt about it, but take a step as God is leading you. That's huge. I've got a friend that recently, as we've gotten to know each other, he was telling the story of how he met his wife, and it was so comical because they met together at a college university. He really liked her from the very beginning. It was one of those things where it was like, I think she's the one for me. And so he was trying to work out ways that they could get together and get to know each other. And so they would have these group dinners together, and he was always sort of making steps to try to get to know her more. All he could think about was this girl. His name was Steve, and all he could think about was her. She went away on some holiday break. The 2 weeks or so that she was away, he kept thinking in his head, I think this could be her, this could be my wife. I want to take this to a new level. I want to approach her when she gets back. She comes back from holiday after 2 weeks, and he says to her, Jennifer, can we go out to dinner, have a date, basically? And her response to him is, remember, his name is Steve, and she says something like, oh, thanks for the invitation, Jeff. Wrong name. She doesn't even know who he is, basically. He took a step, rejection. She says, okay, they do finally get together. Well, long story short, something like 40 years later, they're still married. He took a step. You take a step. Faith is not fatalism. Well, I hope this works out. No, he took a step in the direction towards her. There comes a time when we have to take a step. We seek God, we pray, we get counsel, we wait, and then you take a step. The Scripture says, all hard work brings a profit, but mere talk leads only to poverty. And we can talk about what we wish God would do all day long, and we can pray about it all day long, and we probably should be praying about it constantly. But there are times when God is going to say, take a step. Take a step of faith. After Moses led Israel out of Egypt, they were at the Red Sea. They had nowhere to go. The Egyptians were coming. Where are we going to go? What are we going to do? How are we going to escape this? And so the Scripture says, then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to get moving. Pick up your staff, raise up your hand over the sea, divide the water so the Israelites can walk through the middle of the sea on dry ground. Take a step. Make a move. Do something. That's the next thing that we see. Faith rests in the providence of God. Faith is not fatalism. It requires a move. And then finally, the key to biblical faith, and this I think is most important. The key to biblical faith is the object of faith. There's a faith in faith that is not biblical faith. I got to believe more. I got to work harder at believing more. I got to try harder to have more faith. That's not really biblical faith. Biblical faith is all about the object of faith. There are times in your life where it's like you fret and you're anxious over the desired outcome. God, do this, God, do this, God, do this. And we fret and we're anxious about it. We've taken our eyes off of the object of our faith and on the hope that something will happen. And it's not giving us rest, it's making us more anxious. Has that ever happened to you? Faith is all about the object of your faith. It's not faith in faith. And so that's what we see here in the story is that Ruth and Naomi, in one sense, they put their faith in Boaz. Why? Because they knew Boaz was a noble man. You're going to go to Boaz. Here's what you're going to do. Uncover the corner of his, where his feet are. Ask him to be your covering. She knows that he's an honorable man, the object of her faith. But more than that, remember, she said, I'll go where you go. I'll be with you. I want your God to be my God. And so surely by this time, Ruth is saying, I believe in the God of Israel. I believe in the God of the universe. The object of her faith. He's trustworthy. And so she puts her faith in this God. And that's what we need to do as well. The book of Ruth is a story of renewal. within a greater story of renewal. And what we mean by that is that by faith, redemption was coming for Naomi and Ruth. Light in darkness. And by faith, there's a greater redemption coming through Naomi and Ruth. The true light, Jesus Christ, is coming through Ruth. This is the object of our faith. This is the Christ that we put our faith in. So back to our song, do you feel the world is broken? Do you feel the shadows deepen? But do you know that all the dark won't stop the light from coming through? Do you wish that you could see it all made new? Well, Jesus Christ is the one who makes all things new. He can be trusted, and we're going to look at more of that next week in chapter 4 about the ultimate Redeemer who comes to save us. Let's